Hello, I'm Hannah Donner with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Jay enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnership calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che EDC Strategies Partnership webinar, which is titled Reproductive Outcomes at Changing PFAS Exposures in Minnesota. Our moderator today is Cheryl Patton, Director of Commonwealth's Biomonitoring Resource Center. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available at the top of the menu bar of your window at any point during the presentation. After the presentation, our moderator will read out questions for our speakers to respond to. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period, and we'll follow up on unanswered questions after the webinar. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted today's slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speakers. This webinar is scheduled to last for 45 minutes and will be recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. First up is Dr. Phillipe Grandjean, who conducts international research to assess adverse health effects from exposures to environmental chemicals, especially to PFAS, especially to those occurring prenatally, which as we know is a highly vulnerable early stage of development, where small amounts of exposure to some of these chemicals has enormous effects for afterlife health effects. Later in life health effects. His main focus is on the development of the brain and the immune system as revealed from long-term follow-up of birth cohorts. He is an adjunct professor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and also serves as professor and chair of environmental medicine at the University of Southern Denmark. He directs the STEEP Superfund Center that's in the University of Rhode Island that focuses entirely on PFAS. His presentation will be followed by a presentation by Dr. Gina Waterfield. She's an economist at the Nature Conservancy, where she conducts research on the human benefits of environmental conservation and protection. She previously worked in economic consulting, focusing on economic and statistical analyses in the context of environmental litigation, including the health outcomes associated with harm to natural resources. She received a PhD in agriculture and resource economics from the University of California, Berkeley. So thank you very much for everyone who's joining in, and Dr. Grandjean, Phillipe, let's move in now directly to your presentation.
Well, thank you both for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be with you at CHE. And I think the study that Gina is the first author on is very important because it shows a unique setting that we were able to scrutinize in detail and to extract important information. I will now just give you a little bit of background first of all, the whole setting was described very well in an ATSDR report on the East Metro area, just east of Minneapolis and St. Paul, in particular Lake Elmo and Oakdale within Washington County. And that report was actually authored by the Minnesota Department of Health. Here's the a map of the area, and Minnesota, St. Paul is sort of on the left side of this map. You can see down at Cottage Grove, that's where a major 3M production plant is. And then there are some disposal sites indicated in various areas of the Washington County. And what we are talking about is obviously the water, the groundwater and community water contamination by, in particular, PFAS and PFOA, and also PFBA, which is a C4 compound. So here are some numbers, and the highest numbers in the bottom are not from the municipal waters, but you can see the numbers are in micrograms per liter, and usually we use nanograms per liter. So PFOA was up to something like 600 ppb, not ppt, but you know, a unit which is 1,000 times higher. This is truly a massive contamination. So the state actually did some blood tests of focusing on PFAS and PFOA, and also adding the C6 PFHXS. And you can see people who had lived there for a longer time had a tendency of having accumulated more of these PFASs in the body. Now, being in this setting and trying to figure out what was going on, it was kind of like a late arrival, because PFASs have been used for about 70 years. And this slide shows you a few pieces of what happened over the years. First of all, Dr. Tavis, I think his name is, in 1968 in a paper published in Nature, demonstrated that one could detect organofluorine compounds in human blood, actually his own blood. And later on followed a variety of other discoveries. And you can see that in 2004 was the first report of PFASs in human milk. And in, you know, pretty late in this sequence, breastfeeding was shown to be a major source of PFAS exposure in infants. And the important message here is that all of these news, so to speak, in gray, they were not published at the time. We didn't know. I only got into PFAS research about 2008 or 9, and I was totally unaware of what was going on. Another concern is that papers were published, and this is a paper from Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine in 2003. And this one concerned cholesterol and triglycerides in blood of workers exposed to PFOA in particular. And later on, a draft of this report surfaced that actually provided a whole lot more information, and about 20 tables that documented in detail that yes, indeed, PFOA and PFAS were associated directly with increases in serum lipids. But that was not what the published paper said. And so there was some, at least, tendencies toward overly optimistic information being published. And perhaps one can understand this better if you look at this document that I obtained from the Attorney General in the state of Minnesota. This is a document from 3M about their science publication policy. And I think this underlying sentence here, that the science should demonstrate that there is no medical or scientific basis to attribute any adverse health effects to 3M products. I think that may be what was underlying the decision to publish, I would say, misleading information about the safety of PFASs. I also note that when the state and 3M agreed on a settlement, that 3M at the time, a couple of years ago, insisted we have never believed that there is a PFAS-related health issue. So when we started looking at adverse health effects associated with PFAS exposures, we were up against some severe difficulties. So I summarized them here that they had been used, these compounds, for more than 70 years. And there was very little information from academic sources out in public before 2000. And with all of these concerns, then suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where we have to figure out what is the exposure of this population that has been exposed for so long. And perhaps we can measure some blood concentrations, but how do they reflect what happened, let's say, during a pregnancy several years ago, or how much is retained in the liver or the lungs for that matter? And then we're dealing with mostly outcomes that are not necessarily very specific. So the current concern about PFAS is that we need to look at early life exposures. What happens during pregnancy? What happens during infancy? The so-called DOHAD, the developmental origins of health and disease, or PPtox, the programming, prenatal programming and toxicity. Those approaches to modern toxicology are very important in regard to the PFASs. And we're now seeing that there are more and more studies that link adverse health effects to what happened to the populations during early development. So in this regard, birth weight is, of course, an easily available parameter that can be used in population studies, but it's not specific, and we must rely on birth weight as a proxy variable, because we don't really know what's going on, and probably there are some interferences with organ development, which is not apparent just from the information on birth weight. And what we have come to realize, and this is what the EFSA is saying, the European Food Safety Authority, which about a half year ago released its most updated opinion on PFASs, they're saying that at least for now, the immune system probably should be regarded the most vulnerable to PFASs. It's not necessarily so, but it's just that this is where we have the best evidence. And I will say a few more words about that in a moment. But you can see that we now have a situation, because of there is this delayed scientific insight, that we may find ourselves in the late lessons of early warnings that we didn't receive until after 2000. And now we're trying to extract those late lessons, and hopefully we can apply them on a wider scale. I wanted to show you this slide here from EFSA, because they modeled blood concentrations of, here it's PFOA, also other major PFASs. They modeled the concentrations in blood. And in this case, it's a subject who started out with prenatal exposure from transplacental transfer of PFOA from the mother circulation into the fetal circulation. And you can then see that the serum concentration peaks here at probably about 6 months of age. And they calculated that the peak would correspond to 16 nanograms per mil. And then as the body grows, it gets the PFOA gets diluted, and then there's some buildup during adult life at this intake here of 0.3 nanograms per kilogram body weight per day. So what EFSA said, which I think is very wise, they said we need to control PFAS exposures to prevent infants in reaching such high serum concentrations. And the only way we can do that is by controlling the adults, and particularly the women's exposures, so that they are not transferring excessive amounts of PFASs to the next generation, where they, through breastfeeding, may reach such high concentrations that can be toxic. And based on that, EFSA then released this opinion. And before I will tell you what the concentration limits are, the proposed tolerable exposures, I will show you the current situation in Minnesota. Now, these are, as I understand it, the current guideline values for PFAS and PFOA and the hexa, plus these 2 C4s. So the 3 major PFASs, the total is close to 100 ppt. Now, EFSA's proposal relates to 4 PFASs, including the C9, and using the calculations that EPA use and that Gloria has reviewed in detail, you can translate this weekly or daily intake into what the water limit would be, assuming that water contributes 20% of your daily intake of these compounds. And if you do that, and EFSA didn't do it, so this is my calculation, then this tolerable intake limit will correspond to 5 ppt total for the sum of these 4 here. And you can see the current drinking water guideline for Minnesota is about 20-fold higher. This is my very brief introduction, just to sort of paint the picture that illustrates the situation that we are in, and Gina in particular, when she had to deal with an exposed community and the information that was available on this population that had this, in many cases, very long-term exposures. Now, let me see, this slide here just gives you a little bit of background. I wanted to make sure that you knew that my research is funded entirely from public sources, and you can see some additional information on this slide. I served as a medical expert for the state of Minnesota in the lawsuit against 3M, and I have likewise served on some other lawsuits as a medical expert. So Gina, I will now turn the word to you, if I may.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grandjean, for this excellent presentation. And I want to remind everyone to please type in your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will be addressing those questions at the end of Gina's presentation. So Gina, you want to go ahead, please?
Great, thanks, Cheryl, and thanks to you and Hannah for organizing this webinar and hosting. And thanks as well to Phillipe for that good introduction and that kind of context for our study that was published in Environmental Health that we put together alongside our colleagues at UC Berkeley and the Nature Conservancy. So given that Phillipe has kind of already given a broad overview of sort of the information that's out there regarding PFAS exposure and reproductive outcomes, and a little bit of context on the
study community for our analysis as well. I'm just going to dive in with some of the more technical details and go through some of our findings. So I'll just highlight a few background points that are particularly relevant to our kind of study design and analytical approach. So as Phillipe mentioned, this particular area in sort of lower Washington County, just to the east of Minneapolis and St. Paul, was home to a number of production and disposal, PFAS production and disposal sites at multiple locations over a very long term. And one of the particular areas of concern was the city of Oakdale, which was near a disposal site where really high levels of PFOA and PFAS were detected in some of the municipal wells that supplied drinking water to residents of the city. And those detections were in 2005. And it's also important to note that in the city of Oakdale, almost all of the 27,000 residents were served by that municipal water supply. So we had pretty universal exposure. I think it's 98 to 99% of households were connected to the municipal water supply. So after the PFAS were detected in some of those municipal wells, the city of Oakdale installed a granular activated charcoal filtration system in 2006. And that basically brought PFAS levels in the water down to basically zero. So you have this big dramatic change in exposures across this entire community. In some of the other communities in Washington County, so close to Oakdale, there were levels of PFAS detected in some sampling and residential wells, but the exposure was less consistent and the levels were generally lower, and there wasn't the same large-scale intervention that there was in Oakdale. So our strategy with this study was really to try and leverage this big change in exposure in Oakdale to try and learn more about the causal relationship between PFAS and reproductive outcomes, which is something that hasn't been fully addressed by the literature, and this is hopefully a useful complement to the studies that are out there. So the data that we relied on largely came from the Minnesota Department of Health. We used all singleton birth records in all zip codes that overlapped with Washington County. And we looked at the period 2002 to 2011, so 5 years before and 5 years after the intervention in Oakdale. And the birth record data included birth weight and gestational age, which we use as our primary outcomes of interest, alongside a number of individual level maternal characteristics. So age, marital status, educational attainment. In some cases, we had information on drug use and other medical risk factors, as well as the mother's resident zip code at the time that she gave birth. And that's what we use as our proxy for exposure. So whether the mother resided in Oakdale or one of these other affected communities at the time that she gave birth. And since we know that other sociodemographic characteristics can be important determinants of birth outcomes, but we didn't have that information at the individual level, we also added covariates at the zip code level to kind of proxy for those individual characteristics, and that came from the American Community Survey, which is the yearly census product that's available. So just to give you a sense of what this population looks like and the size of our data set that we were working with, here is a summary of some of those characteristics in the 3 separate regions or groups that we identified or distinguished between for our study. So we have Oakdale, some of these other affected communities, and then the control communities or those zip codes in the rest of Washington County where there wasn't any known detection of PFAS in drinking water. So overall, we had about almost 50,000 individual births in our data set, so certainly a large sample. And I'll skip over these maternal characteristics, but in terms of the newborn characteristics, we'll just highlight our outcomes of interest. So we looked at, in terms of birth weight, the probability of low birth weight, so less than 2,500 grams, and very low birth weight, less than 1,500 grams. And then in terms of gestational age, we looked at preterm birth and then early preterm birth before 32 weeks. And low birth weight, you can see accounted for about 4 to 5% of the births in our data set. Very low birth weight is obviously much less frequent occurrence, less than 1%. Preterm birth was 6 to 7% of the births in our data set. And then early preterm, again, less than 1%. That's just to give you a sense of our population. And then in terms of our identification strategy or the kind of analytical approach we wanted to use to understand what impact this big change in exposures in Oakdale had on birth outcomes, we basically used kind of a modified difference in differences approach. And I just pulled this figure off of Columbia Public Health's website. But I think it's a good illustration of the kind of general approach where you basically compare changes in your intervention or treated group before and after the intervention to changes over that same time period in a control group that wasn't subject to the intervention. So in that way, you're able to control for differences between the two groups that are pre-existing and then trends over time that are common to both groups. So in our particular study, we're comparing changes in outcomes in Oakdale before and after the intervention, this filtration of the water supply, to changes in the control communities and the other affected communities, which implicitly allows us to control for pre-existing and constant differences across these different subpopulations or subgroups, and also allows us to implicitly control for any changes over time. And in addition to those implicit controls, we explicitly controlled for all those covariates that I showed on the previous slide. So that strategy is basically to rule out a number of confounding factors that might otherwise complicate the sort of causal inference. And just to make that very concrete, here's the sort of basic regression equation that we used for all of our analyses. So we look at each particular birth outcome and estimate it as a function of whether the mom resided in Oakdale before the intervention, Oakdale after the intervention, or some of these other affected communities, as well as the individual level maternal characteristics and the zip code characteristics. So really our coefficients of interest are the beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, particularly the difference between beta 1 and beta 2, which shows us how outcomes changed in Oakdale relative to the control communities. So moving on to some of our results, we first looked at the sort of continuous outcomes of birth weight and gestational age. And each of the sort of points or lines here is basically a regression coefficient, the beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 from the previous slide. And I'm showing the results for 3 different variants of our model. So with no controls, with just the individual maternal level controls, and then with the individual and zip code level controls, which is our preferred specification because it does the best job of reducing the noise and gives us the most precise estimates and the best control over different confounding factors. So if we look at panel A, which is with regard to birth weight, and if you look at Oakdale pre-filtration, we see on average birth weight about 35 grams less than in the control communities before filtration, and then slightly higher, although still less than in the control communities after filtration. But there is that slight increase from before to after the filtration. And then looking at gestational age, so panel B on the bottom, we see on average very slightly lower gestational age at time of birth in Oakdale before the filtration, and then after the filtration actually slightly higher than the control area. So we do see that big shift pre to post filtration. But again, these are very small changes with kind of unknown clinical significance. So we next looked at these binary adverse events. So we have first the odds of low birth weight relative to the control area. And you can see that, so these coefficients are presented as relative odds or odds ratios. So this is the odds of low birth weight in Oakdale before filtration relative to the control communities before filtration. So you can see that in Oakdale, the odds of a low birth weight birth were about 1.35 times higher than in the control areas. So a pretty stark difference. And then that difference basically dropped. You have an odds ratio of almost exactly 1 post-filtration. So the difference between those two coefficients kind of gives you a sense of the impact of this reduction in exposures in Oakdale. And we see on average in the other affected communities a slightly higher incidence of low birth weight over the entire sample period, the study period. For very low birth weight, we see a similar pattern, but the results are a lot noisier. That's partly because there are just fewer of these births in our data set, so we're not able to estimate them as precisely, but the point estimates kind of show a similar pattern to low birth weight. And then for preterm birth, we see, again, a similar situation where in Oakdale prior to filtration, the odds of a preterm birth were about 1.15 times the odds of a preterm birth in the control area, and then dropping to actually less than 1, that relative odds ratio after the filtration. And early preterm birth, again, a similar pattern, just a lot noisier. So lastly, we also wanted to try and see if we could use our data to understand anything about the relationship between fertility and PFAS exposure. So we looked at the general fertility rate, or just the number of births per woman of childbearing age in a given population in a given year. And we also looked at that within certain age bands for the mother. And here the results are incidence rate ratios. So a lower incidence rate ratio indicates a lower birth rate, basically, in these communities that we've highlighted relative to the control area or the rest of Washington County. So pre-filtration, you can see that the general fertility rate in Oakdale was about 0.73, 0.75 times the general fertility rate in the rest of the county or within the control area. And that increased very slightly in the post-filtration period. And that's mostly driven, you can see, by the ages 25 to 34 and 35 to 44 mothers. And those two groups represent the majority of births in our data set. So there are far fewer births in the age 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 age ranges. So I will just very quickly summarize our main kind of takeaways. Reduced exposure to PFAS in drinking water in Oakdale following this very large scale intervention was associated with slightly higher birth weight and gestational age on average. But the more striking findings really come down to that filtration apparently significantly reducing the odds of these adverse birth outcomes relative to the control areas. There appears to be some response in the general fertility rate, particularly in those age ranges where births are the most common, but that result definitely seems to be slower and kind of warrants more follow-up. And there are, of course, a number of limitations with our study just based on largely on it being kind of an ex post non-randomized controlled trial type study based on a natural experiment, as we call it in economics and social sciences. Really, the kind of biggest kind of caveat is that we don't know exposures at the individual kind of mother level. We just know that there was kind of large exposure in Oakdale and some exposure in these other communities, and then it basically dropped to 0 in Oakdale after the intervention. So given that, we can't disentangle the effects of these different PFAS from one another. And although we have a number of controls and this quasi-experimental study design, we certainly cannot ever rule out any other confounding factors. So I think I will leave it there and hope for some questions. Yeah.
Okay, Thanks very much for that excellent presentation. I mean, this is a really important study that you all have done, and it's one of the few that can relate different levels of PFAS exposures to health outcomes. And so thanks very much for doing this. I know there's a lot of questions about it, but it really opens the door to try to pin down what's happening with everyone's exposure to PFAS. I want to open with just a couple of questions using my prerogative as a facilitator. It seems that the effects happen fairly quickly after the filtration system is put in. Do I understand that correctly, or how would you answer that? Because usually it takes a little bit of time for something to actually change in terms. And some of these PFASs, these are the long chain ones, can take residence up in serum for a while. So I'm just wondering how you explain the quickness, apparently, relatively speaking, the quickness of the outcome of the change in fertility rates and low birth rate. And whoever would like to answer, either one of you, please.
Is that you, Gina?
I can provide a sort of more statistical technical answer, and then Phillipe, you certainly jump in with any biological rationale. But from a statistical standpoint, what we did was really averaged over that 5-year pre-intervention and 5-year post-intervention. And we did that just because that was really what was feasible from a study design perspective. We couldn't look at results on a year-by-year basis. Mm-hmm. So the effect that we're estimating is an average over the 5-year period after the intervention.
Let me just ask that there are multiple PFASs involved, and one of them is a PFBA, which has a much shorter half-life in the body. And if some of those PFASs with a shorter half-life play a role, in addition to PFAS and PFOA, then that could add to the rapidity, the speed of the change that we see after the filtration started. It's also possible that, let's say you're drinking this water with PFAS and PFOA, and when you absorb these PFASs into the body, they may be more labile before they get bound to albumin or whatever proteins in the blood. And perhaps that's when they can seep through the placenta more rapidly into the fetal circulation and cause reproductive toxicity. It's not necessarily the total amount of PFOA in the blood, because some of that may be, it's hard to move, and it may not pass through the placenta very rapidly. So there are issues like that we don't really understand. But I would say the bottom line is that this is good news, that we can see improvements soon after the installation of filtration.
Oh, yes, it is good news. Oh, thank you. That's a really interesting response. Thank you very much for that. And just one more question from me. Would you expect, Phillipe, to see some changes in the immune system that could be measured by children's responses to vaccination in the exposed population that might have changed once the filtration system was put in? Would that be a measurable outcome?
I would think so. Because, I mean, we don't know, Gina and I don't know what exactly the blood levels are, but we know that the state has done measurements. And with longer duration of residence in these metro area, we can see higher serum concentrations. If that applies to the mothers of the children, if those levels apply, then I would say that certainly in the range of concentrations where other studies, most recently in Germany, have found that the children that those mothers have given birth to and perhaps breastfed, those children will likely show deficits in their antibody responses to vaccinations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, let me go to some of the questions that have been posted. There's quite a few, and we'll see how many we can get to in the time remaining. And thank you very much for letting me jump in and ask my own question. From someone anonymous, can you explain more about the other affected communities and what happened in these areas? Are they the controls for your study, and are there any unexposed controls? I think you discussed it. Did their exposure change over the time period study?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think one of the reasons we included those in the sort of other affected communities is because we didn't have great insight into or as concrete understanding of what exposures look like in those communities. So a lot of those communities are more dependent on residential and domestic wells, so private wells that households have, and there's obviously less consistent exposure across those than in the case of Oakdale, where there's a municipal supply that supplies all the residents within the community. In some cases where there were particularly high levels detected in some domestic wells, I believe there were some smaller interventions where bottled water was distributed, where there was an effort to connect some homes to municipal water supplies instead of relying on their own private wells. But generally, I think the levels of exposure in these communities were sort of lower and certainly less consistent, which is why we wanted to treat them separately. And there's certainly some possibility that some of our controls and treatment groups are not precisely defined, and that would, to the extent that we're not measuring exposure perfectly, that would just sort of tend to bias our effect estimates towards zero. Noise in your treatment variable just leads to attenuation bias.
Thank you. Here's a question from Laurie Verbruge. Could the GAC filtration also have removed other chemicals besides PFAS, and could that be a confounding factor?
I don't know if you want to speak to that, Phillipe, but I think that's certainly a plausible possibility and one that we can't really rule out since our measure of exposure is entirely tied to that intervention. One thing we can say is that some of those other contaminants are better understood, more well studied, and given that the Oakdale disposal site in particular was a Superfund site, there was monitoring for those other contaminants. And they were not at levels as far above guidance as PFAS.
Sorry.
I mean, we have to rely on what the state knows. And what we were told was that the PFASs were the major contaminants, and certainly they're very plausible causes of the associations that Gina has documented. And it's hard to imagine exposures that would, cover this range of years and parallel the effects that we have seen in association with the PFAS contamination of the water. So I mean, we can't rule it out, but it's not likely, I would say.
Okay, thank you. And here's a question from Sue Fenton. Thanks, Sue, for joining. Gina, can you determine if hypertensive disorders of pregnancy are the cause of the reduced birth weight that you are detecting? And what is driving the reduced birth weight data? And other cohorts and mouse studies suggest that PFAS that you're looking at actually can cause preeclampsia.
Yeah, that would be certainly very interesting to look at. And we had, I think, data on preeclampsia and other risk factors for some of the birth records, but it didn't appear to be kind of consistently collected across locations and across time. So we weren't able to include it in any analyses that we really wanted to present as our primary specifications. All we can say is that including them where that data was collected in our analyses didn't change our main results. But we can't really speak to the mechanisms, I don't think, through which that happened.
And I'd also say that we're looking at the tip of an iceberg here. I mean, birth weight is a very crude parameter. And when we can see something, and it may just be 29 grams, and birth weights vary. There are, for example, the parental height is a major predictor. We didn't have it. We didn't have parental height. We didn't have maternal weight gain during pregnancy or, other information like that. But we could still see it. And when a baby is born with a lower birth weight than it should have been born with, it's probably because there were some metabolic interferences. And once you see those kind of interferences prenatally, at a time where the body is programming its organs and its complete function as a mature human being. This is a red light. This is like a signal, hey, there's something bad going on here. It's not the birth weight as such. It's the implications of low birth weight, in particular those with very low birth weight. I don't know what you say, Gina.
No, I agree. I don't have anything to add to that. I think that sums it up.
A question from Jerry Heindel asking, can you follow the children to look for more subtle effects on metabolism, learning, behavior, etc.? Would that be possible?
Unfortunately, not possible with the data that we have. I think all we can point to is that we did identify this strong relationship between exposure and the probability of these adverse birth outcomes that other studies have certainly documented pretty rigorously are correlated with all manner of adverse outcomes later in life.
Okay. Thank you. Let me see. I'm just scrolling through the questions here because we have quite a... Hannah, how are we doing on time?
We're doing fine. We can take a few more.
Just one more, okay. And Linda Birnbaum remarks that JSA filtration does not remove most of the short-chained PFAS chemicals. So, want to comment on that?
It's apparent that a PFBA was a major contaminant of this area, and I would say for that reason it would be very, very important to carry out some additional studies if they're still possible, because PFBA sort of moves through the body much more rapidly. And surprisingly, it's the PFAS that concentrates the most in the lungs. And so it leaves the blood. It doesn't necessarily mean it leaves the body. Some may appear in the urine, but there is still so much we need to learn about the different PFASs. We got a very late start, and the study that Gina worked so hard on is just essentially scratching the surface, despite the fact that it was many, many thousand births and a lot of data to work on. We still don't understand all the details about these chemicals that have been around for more than 70 years and caused human exposures and environmental contamination. So we have a lot of work in front of us, and this is just a tiny little contribution in my mind. I'm sorry, Gina, it's nothing personal.
Well, I think
I
it's a
agree.
huge contribution.
Totally agree.
I mean, it is certainly a start, but it's an amazingly important start. So here's a question from an anonymous person. What mitigation technologies are you aware of that are being used to remove PFAS chemicals from the source areas that are currently probably still contaminating the drinking water of Oakland?
I don't know about any mitigation actions that are feasible for removing contaminants from groundwater before it's extracted. And that's beyond me and my expertise. I don't know about you, Phillipe.
Maybe reverse osmosis, but it's probably much more expensive. So it's probably also a matter of finances.
Yes, I think it's true. All right. All right, I think that's most of our questions here. I think
sure there are more.
Yes, if you see what that I'm scrolling through that can be that you would like to answer. I'm trying to find the most relevant ones to your presentation.
There's one from Gail Prinz. Says, are there any other health outcomes that can be or are currently being monitored in this population?
Well, obviously, certain types of mortality, cancer incidence, and there is information on cancer incidence and Gina, you looked at childhood cancers, so there are some opportunities that could be taken up.
Yeah, I think generally it's just that the cancer incidence data is more sensitive and less available to kind of the public for research.
Okay. All right, I think just to remind everyone, the questions that we did not get to in this webinar, we will be sending to the presenters and for them to answer as much as time as they have to give to this, and we will be posting those questions and answers on the CHE website. But I do think we have come to the end of our time here for today, and I want to thank the presenters for this interesting webinar and also for your incredibly important research, and we'll be all watching for the next steps in these kinds of studies. And so thank you very much, Phillipe Grandjean, and to Gina Waterfield. Hannah, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you so much, Cheryl. We are approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and tomorrow you will receive an email containing a link to the video. The next CHE Partnership webinar will take place September 29th and is titled Pulmonary Health, ARDS, COVID-19, and Air Pollution. CHE is also partnering with the University of California, San Francisco's Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment, or PRE, the Environment Research and Translation for Health Earth Center, and the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, for FIGO, and the Endocrine Society to bring you a new webinar series on the environment and reproductive health, very relevant to this topic today. Stay tuned for details, which will be posted shortly on our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE Partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. Finally, if you have questions we didn't have a chance to answer during our Q&A portion of our webinar today, please submit them to Cheryl Patton at the email listed in our final slide by September 16th, and we will respond via email as well as we can. With that, I want to wish everyone health and wellness, and I also want to thank our speakers, Dr. Grandjean and Dr. Waterfield, for taking time to present today, and to you, Cheryl, for your excellent moderation. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day.